Welcome back, everybody. Second part of the programme, also split into two parts. It's very symmetrical today. This is the presentation of the Reuters Institute Digital News Report 2019. And I'm thrilled to welcome Rasmus Nielsen, who is the Research Director at the Reuters Institute, and also a PhD out of our own programme here, housed in Columbia. So it's always just terrific to see him and his amazing work, and we're very pleased to be able to host it. Rasmus is going to talk through the results, and then we are going to have a discussion with a stellar panel afterwards. So I'm going to, at this point, I'm going to hand over to Rasmus.
Thanks very much, Emily. It's a real pleasure to be back at the Journalism School to launch this. This is an annual report that we do at the Reuters Institute in pursuit of our mission to connect research with the issues faced by news media journalists around the world. And really the premise of the piece of work I'll present today is the very simple assumption that we work from, that journalism exists in the context of its audience. Whether you think about the public importance of journalism in terms of how it can change the world, inform the public, and the like, or whether you think about its legitimacy or indeed its commercial sustainability, it has to exist in the context of a relationship with the audience. This is why we put user research, really, and audience research, and all these forms at the center of the research we do at the Institute to try to inform the work done by practicing journalists, by media executives, by technology companies, and policymakers around the world, as we together think about the challenges and opportunities of journalism in the 21st century. This is the central piece of that research. Our annual report is the biggest ongoing survey of news and media users around the world, 37 markets across 5 continents this year. It is an online survey, so I should say that the numbers here will underrepresent behaviors of people who do not have access to the internet, which is a minor, if you will, correction in a country like the US, but of course makes a significant difference in some of the markets that we cover. These are the countries that we cover in the report this year. It's made possible by support by a wide variety of different partners and sponsors that include media organizations like the BBC, media industry associations like the Korean Press Foundation, media regulators like Ofcom, foundations, universities, as well as technology companies like Google, who is one of the sponsors of this report. So this is a collaborative enterprise in which we at the Institute are responsible for research and the analysis, but we are supported by a range of different stakeholders. This is a very rich report. I encourage all of you to check out the report. If you fancy hard copies, they are at the back of the room when you leave at the end of the day. But otherwise, there is a website where you can download the report and play with the data, all of which is publicly available. I will just try to highlight what we think is the 5 key takeaways from this year's report, and to set up the conversation with the fantastic panel that we have later as part of this event. So the key points, really, from our point of view, from this year's report are the following. We see, first of all, for the first time in all the years that we have done this research, a decline in the number of people who say they get news from social media. So this is after a period in which, in many countries, in just 5 years, social media became an absolutely central platform for news discovery and distribution. We now see in some markets actually a quite marked decline. Social media is clearly still very important, but slightly less so perhaps than last year as a medium for discovering news. Secondly, we have heightened concerns over discussion around so-called fake news and more widely unreliable information on the web, and also some research on what the public thinks are the actions to do something about this problem. We have new data on developments in the business, where it's clear that this is a very challenging environment. The competition for attention and for advertising continues to intensify, but we also see some incremental progress around subscriptions and donations as ways of funding the adoption of quality journalism. We have, for the first time now, brand level trust. So we have long asked questions about whether people trust news in general, but we now this year have new data on people's trust in different ways of discovering information, as well as their trust in individual brands, which of course, as a company like Facebook is rolling out trust as one of the signals in their ranking algorithms, is a point of much larger and wider importance than just the question of how anyone's brand is perceived. And finally, we have data on how voice and audio are new frontiers for opportunities for journalism as these technologies mature. So each point quickly and in turn before we kick off the panel discussion and later the discussion before you take time to come today. Social media use overall is stable in most of the countries that we look at, so this is not a decline in the overall use of social media, but there is a clear decline in several major markets in the percentage of people who say they use social media as a source of news. This is driven more than anything by a decline specifically on Facebook. So again, there's no decline in the overall use of Facebook in our data, but there's a clear decline in the percentage of respondents who say that they get news while using Facebook. Twitter is stagnant, has been so for the period covered here in terms of the percentage of respondents who say they get news via Twitter, whereas we see growth in some other platforms, including perhaps most importantly, private messaging applications like WhatsApp. And the overall figure here is already one in which more people in the 37 markets we cover say they get news via WhatsApp than get news via Twitter. And there's enormous country-to-country variation in this area, where in some countries this is already more widely used as a mean of sharing and discovering news than social media is, whereas in some other countries it's still in the early days, where it's low single digits of people who say they use messaging apps for news. Really, we identify three reasons for the shift. Some of this, of course, is about the strategy and the deliberate decisions made by platform companies like Facebook to change their algorithms. But we also see in our user research and focus groups perhaps elements of boredom with the experience of using Facebook among some users, as well as a feeling among some that there are some interesting alternatives that might supplement their use of Facebook, but also embracing various other platforms, some of them, of course, owned by Facebook, like WhatsApp and Instagram. So especially younger users say they are attracted to neural networks, like Snapchat, for example, and Instagram. But we also have, if you will, a situation where people feel that essentially for political reasons, they might move their news consumption and news discussions to private environments, like WhatsApp, where they have more control over who they share information with, and they feel they have in an environment like Facebook. And in particular, of course, in very polarized political environments, which is certainly the case in this country, but also in the UK, where people may not feel they want to discuss news or share news in front of all the different people they're connected with on Facebook. There are some people who are actually sort of pulling away from discussing the news on a platform like Facebook. We turn next to the question of trust, the ways in which these changes in discovery, the ways in which distributed discovery and distributed content supplement direct discovery. We have a set of questions in part about how, the degree of trust that people have in different ways of finding news, different sources of news, but also about their trust in individual brands. So first, at a high level, we find across 37 markets that 51% of our respondents say they have a great deal or a high degree of confidence in the news that they use. Whether you think 51% is a lot or a little here, I think is an interesting question. Just over a majority of our respondents say they trust the news they use. 44% express a great deal of trust or some degree of trust in news overall, whereas when it comes to the news that they discover through search, it's only about a third, and trust in news that they discover via social is only about a quarter of respondents who say that they have trust in the news that they see in these environments. When we look at an individual country like the US, the numbers are somewhat different. So in a polarized environment like the US, there's lower degrees of trust in news in general, even if there's the same level of trust in the brands that people use themselves, and lower levels of trust in news in both search and social in an environment where the political discussion is so polarized and opinions so divergent that people may not actually feel that the information that they come across in this distributed environment is something that they can rely upon. When we try to look at the brand level, which of course is important in part for journalists and news organizations in terms of getting their content out to people and actually making sure that people take this seriously and act on it and are informed by it and perhaps also pay for it, but also important as companies like Facebook and others are thinking about ways of making trust one of the several ranking signals used to serve this content. We have tried to sort of survey people on their trust in brands that they have heard of, as well as brands that they personally use, and see some quite generally some interesting patterns, if you will, where generally, unsurprisingly, people have quite high levels of trust on the scale from 0 to 10, about in the 6, 7 X levels of trust in the brands they themselves use. But their trust in brands that they have heard of but do not use vary significantly. Here, generally, we find in most markets that sort of local news and broadcast brands are often the most trusted brands. Off-market newspapers are generally next, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and the like. Digitally born brands are often trusted less. Here, of course, they would say that trust is not the same as trustworthiness, and we tend to trust things we are familiar with, which is hard if you're a new entrant. And often partisan brands very trusted by their users, but not trusted by the broad public. So for example, Breitbart has about the same level of score in trustworthiness from their users as most other brands, but much, much lower from the public at large. This discussion around trust, in our view, intersects powerfully with the whole wider issue of quote-unquote fake news, a term that is both dangerous and misleading, but also such a catchy one that I couldn't assist with some of these slides too, of course, like everybody else. So we surveyed, for example, people just about their level of concern about whether the information that they come across on the web, whether they feel they have challenges in discerning what is true, what is real, and what is fake on the web. And here we see very, very different levels of concern in different countries. So we have many countries, including the US, where 64 or more % of users say that they express concern over whether the information that they get online is real or fake. In some countries like Brazil, the figure is much, much higher. But also in less polarized political environments like much of continental, especially Northern Europe, the levels of concern are much, much lower. There's much, much lower number of people who express these concerns. Even, of course, though, in these environments, platforms like Facebook and Google are used as widely as they are in countries like the US. It's clear that some of this issue of trust is about technology, but it's also very clear that it powerfully intersects with the political context and the social context, that there is very, very significant country to country. One side of this, of course, is whether politicians actively whether they have come across the last week instances of politicians using the term fake news to try to delegitimize and undercut independent news media in the country. It will not surprise you that this is quite a widespread phenomenon in the US, where about half of our respondents can think of examples in the last week where they've come across politicians using this term to attack the media. And this is also the case in other polarized political environments like Hungary and Turkey. I thought I would never put the US, Hungary, and Turkey in the same basket in terms of their political media environment, but here we are. Whereas in much of continental Europe, again, this is much less widespread concern. There are much lower numbers of people who say that they have come across examples of politicians using the term fake news to try to undercut the credibility of independent news media. But there's another side to this concern from the public's point of view, which is that much of the discussion around fake news in part has dealt with this question of the politicization of the term by powerful politicians, and then of course largely with these concerns over fabricated content, whether it's produced by state-backed information operations trying to undercut elections and political processes in other countries, or for that matter, for-profit fabrication by the now infamous Macedonian teenagers. But last year, when we did focus groups around this issue and asked people to give examples of what they consider examples of fake news, the most frequent responses from ordinary media users are not fabricated content. It's what they consider to be examples of poor journalism and hyper-partisan political discourse. These are the first examples people volunteer as what fake news means for them. So this year, to get a grip on how widespread concerns are over this, we tried to survey people and ask them about whether they had personal experience of forms of journalism that were so poor they considered them forms of disinformation or forms of hyper-partisan political discourse. Compared that with their concern over fabricated content, like the more sort of ideal types, if you will, of disinformation. And the numbers, I think, are quite thought-provoking. So when we asked people about what kinds of fake news they have been exposed to personally, not the kinds they're concerned with other people being exposed to, but what they themselves personally have been exposed to the last week, 42% say they've come across examples of poor journalism, mistakes, and clickbait in the last week. 39% complain about spin and agenda-filled news that they feel is not duly impartial or independent of political power or just advancing an agenda in a one-sided fashion. And only 26% say they've been exposed to what we might think of sort of classic fake news, completely fabricated information, whether for political or for-profit purposes. So in light of this documentation, that from the point of view of the public, the problem of fake news or disinformation is very different from the way in which many elites discuss it. Many journalists, I think, often rightly think essentially that disinformation, fake news is other people's problem, right? We are the good stuff, and then there is bad stuff out there. And each of us in this room may individually, to a greater or lesser extent, share that view. But that's not the way in which the public sees it. Whenever someone uses the term fake news, what the public hears often, oh, they're talking about poor journalism. Oh, they're talking about hyper-partisan political discourse. So in this sense, the term itself is resonating with a deeply felt set of concerns around the quality of journalism as it exists, the quality of our political discourse as it exists. And it's much more of much of the public about these long-standing concerns than about the things that most of us probably mean when we use the term fake news, which is truly fabricated content, whether for profit or for political manipulation. And a lot of these findings, I think it's probably not surprising that when we ask people who they feel should do something about trying to counter disinformation on the web, the responses are quite different from the ones you might hear in Brussels or in Washington, D.C., which is that, first of all, 75% of our respondents feel that publishers have a responsibility to do something about disinformation online. 71% say that platform companies have a responsibility to do something about it, and 61% say that government has a responsibility to do something about it. And of course, this last figure breaks down very differently in different parts of the world. This is just Europe and the US. The numbers are far higher in many Asian and Latin American countries, but about 60% in Europe and 41% in the US specifically say they feel governments should do something about disinformation online. And in the focus groups, the arguments that are advanced are the ones that you might expect. So in Germany, there is some sympathy among some users for the Network Enforcement Act, whereas in the US, in focus groups, people will sort of advance what we might think of as first principle, First Amendment arguments about free speech. This, for us, I think, is important not only in terms of understanding the place of journalism in society. Just a quick recap. The discussion around people's perception of journalism and trust in journalism is, of course, important for the public role of journalism. Journalists' ability to reach an audience, inform them, empower them to act in the world. But it's, of course, also powerfully connected with the question of the economic sustainability of the business of news. If people do not trust journalism, if they do not find it empowers them, why do they pay for it? So we've asked a set of questions around pay, and I think it's important to think about this pay behavior in the light of what we have revealed around the uneven and often quite dim view that people have of much of the journalism they post. So we see, if you will, some incremental progress in the area of paying for news. We see 16% in the US say they paid in some way for news in the past year, and the Trump bump we identified last year, where in particular sort of off-market newspapers saw a significant uptick in subscriptions after the 2016 election, seems to have been maintained, often driven by younger people and people on the political left. But this is not the case in every market. So, for example, in the UK, only 7% say they pay for news online, whereas there are other parts of the world in which the figure is much higher than it is in the US. So, for example, in the Nordic countries, on average, 22% of our respondents say that they pay for online news. In the Nordic countries, I came back to the US really only to say the census actually paid, which is not showing up on the screen.
It's funny. You can still say yes.
What was that?
You can still say yes.
This was a sentence I really wanted to come back to. The Nordic countries lead the world. But fundamentally, in seriousness, what the takeaway here is that I think the verdict is clear that there is a growing awareness among much of the public that some journalism, but not all journalism, is worth paying for. And I think this is encouraging. This idea that there was a culture of free that was unbreakable is simply wrong. But that does not mean that people are willing to pay for all forms of journalism as they currently exist online. But that we see very clear progress being made by some organizations and in some markets. Another side of this is the question of donation, which of course has long been a model in the US for public media, but is one that more and more other organizations are looking at, whether legacy organizations like The Guardian or new entrants like The Correspondent that are trying to build up donation or membership-based models, some of them with quite extraordinary results in quite a short period of time. So The Guardian, for example, reporting 300,000 one-off donations last year and 300,000 people signing up as members, or of course many different kinds of news organizations are pursuing these different member models. In the US this year, just 3% of our respondents say they made a donation to a news organization. That's still quite a lot of people in a large country like this. But also perhaps more encouragingly, more than a quarter of our respondents say they might be interested in making a donation in the future. The question is essentially what would motivate people to do this. And we, in our focus groups, come across a number of different motivations that seem central to people's decision to support media through donations or memberships. Support for independent media. People believe in the intrinsic value of there being independent media in the world and willing to support this as a philanthropic or nonprofit cause. An element of guilt in some cases. People have availed themselves of freely available content and are perhaps sort of being guilt-tripped by outlets like the ones that are used diligently by The Guardian to actually also part with some of their money. But also sometimes people identify with a cause and they see a mission-driven news organization that they will support the same way in which they might support an NGO or another advocacy-type organization. There is an interesting intersection between media literacy and willingness to pay or donate. This year we asked people about whether they thought that most news organizations make a profit off of their digital news. Most people think that is the case. 68% of our respondents are unaware that the news industry is actually facing quite a lot of challenges in terms of making a profit off of digital news. This is, I think, from our point of view, for those of us who live and breathe in these discussions, is an astonishing figure. There are very few people in this room who would believe that digital news is a hugely profitable business for publishers, whether legacy or digital born. But actually, in focus groups, people who reason quite simply, they say, well, they give it away for free and they're lost advertising, hence they must be making money, right? They do not know what the CPMs are like. And I think it's an entirely understandable perspective from the point of view of the public, but people are not aware that the business of digital news is very challenging. The reason this is important around the issue of aid and donations is that we find that there is a clear relationship between people's level of news literacy, how many different factual questions about the state of news media today they get right when we ask them, and then whether they are paying or donating to support the news. The more news literate people are, the more likely they are to pay, and the more likely they are to say that they will pay or donate in the future. So perhaps here there's an opportunity to actually try to establish a different starting point for a conversation with the public about paying for news or supporting news in other ways. The final topic I want to run through quickly before just summarizing a few points of discussion and turning it over to our amazing panel who are ready and raring to go, far more interesting than me, is the future of audio. So podcasting, of course, already is a big deal in this country in particular. More and more countries around the world are looking towards this. We see very interesting differences where amongst older users, radio news is more widely used or as widely used, whereas amongst younger people, podcasts are clearly more popular and more used than conventional radio. But of course, the next step in this is not simply about the podcasting content, but also about the means of discovery, where people are more and more interested in voice systems, whether they are on phones or increasingly on smart speakers. So we've seen already just in 2 years a marked increase in the number of people who say they have smart speakers or voice-activated speakers in their home from a very low base, admittedly, but this is a very rapid growth already and far faster than what we've seen in smartwatches, for example, that never really became more than a niche product. This is really taking off. And when we ask people about what they use these speakers for, of course, many of the use cases are directly tied to various forms of news and information that publishers have historically provided and that people can now access through these various voice-activated systems, either speakers, their phone, and in the future, their car as well. So in a way, there is an arc here before I turn over the questions that is one way to kick off the discussion, which is where I started by saying that some of the platforms that we've been most interested in recent years that have, in a very short time, have become incredibly central to the distribution, the discovery, and consumption of news. Social media may now perhaps have sort of matured and even somewhat declined in their importance in terms of news distribution, at least in some markets. And even as that is the case, there are other forms of discovery and whole new frontiers to the development and delivery of news, like voice, but also private messaging apps, where platform companies, again, are incredibly central. Because, of course, the future of voice is in part about what publishers want to do with voice and audio, but it's also clear that it's also about platform publishers working at finding ways of handling the relationship. And I suppose one question that may be a theme running our discussion as we turn over to the panelists, how much have we learned from the research by Emily and her team, of course, but also the practical experience of the last 15 years or so of platforms and publishers dealing with each other? Have we learned enough that the next iteration of this relationship, which will be around private messaging apps and voice, will be more constructive, perhaps more productive than the ones we've seen in the past? Okay, so points for discussion before we convene the panel here. Here are some possible points that really the panelists will provide. These are just for people's consideration. These are some of the things we drew out from our report. There is a question about how major platforms like Facebook and their changing strategies. What is the impact for the news industry? I suspect that some of the panelists will have views on this. It's clear also that as more and more platforms, this is not only Facebook, but also others, are considering to use various forms of signals of trust to define what content they surface. Will this reinforce old legacy brands at the expense of new voices, or are there ways in which this can benefit things that are not simply trusted, but perhaps even trustworthy? There is a question about how should reflect on this data that we have generated that shows quite powerfully, I think, that much of the public hold them to account for what they perceive to be very poor quality information in the public sphere. And there are the questions about how all of this intersects with the perennial issue of how we ensure the economic sustainability that enables editorial independence. And then, of course, ever onwards in the technological revolution, where the next issues are private messaging apps, and then, of course, these issues around audio, podcast, and voice. So with that, I think we should draw this to a close on my part, and then bring the panel on the stage. Thank you very much.
which is anyway. I'm not saying it's not your birthday, Campbell. That's right. So to introduce, the panel that needs no introduction, to run down the line from my far right, Rasmus, my person you've already met. Next to him, Erica Anderson, who is global head of everything and partnerships at Google. I didn't get your precise title right, but it's broadly that. Lydia Pulgrim, who is global head of everything at Huffington Post, chief at Huffington Post. Amber Brown, who is head of news partnerships at Facebook, so basically head of everything now at Facebook as well. And Mark Thompson, who is chief executive of the New York Times. So welcome, panel. So let's just start with sort of Rasmus's publications. And I do like it when you're a moderator, somebody actually says, here we go talking. Which is sort of that, and it kind of that really broad question of what have we learned? Because it's something I think about when I look at our data, particularly looking at the Reuters data this morning, which is I sometimes wonder now, what is it that both platforms are thinking you're trying to achieve with intersecting with news organisations and the news organisations? We're constantly talking about sustainability because that's still what we're trying to achieve rather than other aims. So, Mark, can I start with you on that one?
Thanks. Thank you. So, look, economic sustainability and profitability are like a necessary but not sufficient concern. I mean, trying to build effective digital revenue streams for high-quality journalism. That task is far from over. It's been going kind of badly for the New York Times. I don't think we're kind of out of the woods on that. So that's important. But I think what's so interesting about the way the debate's going is I think it's taking us into the realm of civics as well, about the role of journalism in society, the role, responsibilities, or lack thereof on the major platforms in supporting plurality and democratic debate and so forth. But also, what kind of public do we want? I mean, one of the basic things I want to say is, I think we want wholly trusting audiences. So the idea that we should be tending to 100% on all those bar charts is we want critical audiences. We want audiences who are testing ideas, are often skeptical about institutions, that means political institutions, I mean legal institutions. So in a way, I think we need to kind of, if the theme of recent Reuters reports, but also the industry, is endlessly about the economics, I think we need to thicken the plot a bit and think about some of these broader issues.
Right, yes, we call pivot to civics. It does feel like that's we kind of like, we extrapolated that from our research, if you like, for all sorts of external reasons. And that sort of seems to be showing up here as well. What does Facebook think it's doing now?
Well, there's been a big change. I mean, very frankly, a huge change this year in terms of how we think about ranking. And so, well, it's not up there anymore, but the slide that talked about whether Facebook is moving away from news with less news on the platform. I don't think of it that way at all. It's that we had a very broad definition of news before. And it included clickbait and sensationalism and a lot of things that people don't want to see on the platform. So what we've done is condense the definition of news. We turned down the volume pretty massively on clickbait, sensationalism, the stories that had the misleading headlines, leaving out information, and we made a ton of ranking changes on that front to take down that type of less quality news, and to try then turn up the volume on how we define quality news through a number of different levers, from surveys to the community about who they trust and who they don't, to signals that we develop with outside academics and publishers to try to define quality so that we can give that a bigger boost. So overall, it's a change in the ratio of news on the platform.
I'm going to put a pin in that because I know that Mark has some pretty strong views about that from being at labour markets. meeting earlier in the week where you had some very specific things to say. But yes, it was very specific. I'm going to get down the line before we get to that. I think we're main event of the wrestling. So
that'd be fun.
So Lydia,
yes,
you know, you're one of these digitally native born creatures at the Huffington Post, but you've kind of also shifted your strategy really significantly since you started as editor-in-chief. And you know, when Ariana Huffington started it was, you know, a platform for all loud voices and like a Facebook type platform.
Yeah.
But now you're actually kind of you shifted. So how's it, you know, again, how does that play into what we're seeing?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are lots of sort of fascinating directions to go with that question. You know, there was a lot in this about the economics, and I think Mark is right that we need to focus on the civics, but these things are actually like deeply connected. You know, one of the things that I pulled out of the report was that 26% of people in the United States and 18% of people in the UK would consider paying for news in the future. That's encouraging. It's also a tiny slice of the population. And I think that as we think about business models, as we think about distribution, I'm really concerned that there's been a strong focus on the subscription model as being the sort of panacea, the savior of the news business. If we're living in a world where 74% of Americans are not willing to consider paying for news in the future, who's going to inform those people? How are they going to become, you know, informed citizens? How are we going to have a solid and stable society if we're moving towards a world in which our main hope for the future of journalism is people paying for subscriptions? Now, we're very fortunate in that we have great news organizations like the New York Times that make the vast majority of journalism available for anyone to read, and you know, just a tiny percentage of Times subscribers, Times of the Times audience actually become subscribers, and it's a fantastic thing that they're able to execute a highly successful pay model on that. But I do think a lot about the audience that's never going to pay for news and how we serve them. And that's the category that I think has seen the greatest impact from the platforms. And we're also seeing a tremendous amount of consolidation there. So there are fewer voices. There's less. You're less able to sustain your voice as an independent news organization. And it's interesting because there's a very sharp partisan divide there. You have essentially non-going concerns on the far right that are supported by patrons, and then on the left you've got a handful of organizations that are supported by patrons and by donations. But you know, kind of in the center left and less so on the center right, I think there's a tremendous battle right now going on over how organizations like HuffPost, BuzzFeed, and Fox, who I think are doing really vital journalism, are going to survive in the current climate, providing free to consumer journalism that's really important to our society.
Erica, you've got so Google has recently said that it's moving money into the market, as it were, $300 million, I think it is, to replicate kind of the digital news initiative. I mean, sounds a big sum, it's a tiny sum in terms of news. Why are you doing that? And you know, again, what do you why now?
Yeah. Well, it's great to be here. Thank you for hosting this. And I would, preface this by saying in March, we kind of looked around the company and we're doing a lot. We are doing a lot. We've had a commitment to the news industry for about 15 years. We have a digital news initiative in Europe, the News Lab in the US, which went global, focused on training in one part. We're doing a lot of product working groups to develop products with the industry, which lets a hand and then subscribe to Google. But we really need to align and have like a unification internally and then also externally. So Google News Initiative, which we announced in March, is really about three things. First and foremost, it's about helping journalism thrive in the digital age and like saying that out loud and being accountable to that. But it's about three things. It's number one, elevating and strengthening, which I think is what we're talking about right now. It's number 2, economics. It's about building new financial models in addition to the ads model. So we launched Subscribe with Google. And then number 3, it's about empowering technological innovation. So your question, why now? Because there's a lot of people inside the company that care about this. There are a lot of things happening, and we knew these needs to be more. So the 300 million, right now we're figuring out like what's the structure and form look like. We know we're going to work on product. Seeing a lot of product working groups. I mean, if you subscribe with Google, I think we worked with we have 18 working groups with over 80 news organizations, because we ultimately know that Google can't build products without close collaboration with the industry. And then, yeah, we're figuring out right now like what the fund looks like, if it's taking learnings from D&I. So like more to come on that, but ultimately, having quality content on our platform like really matters. So people come to Google looking for information they can trust.
Right. And so Rasmus, from your kind of 30,000 foot view of this, we hear a lot of talk about we want to elevate quality journalism, we want to help journalism thrive in the digital age. How do you kind of think about that as, academic researcher who's been looking at that? Because there's some terms there that are incredibly hard to define.
Sure. I mean, I think there are, in terms around what kind of content is surfaced and how much, there are really only 2 kinds of criticism of platform companies, right? One is that they either do too much or do too little to judge content. Okay, that's one criticism. The other one is that they either serve too much or too little of other people's content, right? So essentially, Facebook either has too much news on it or too little news on it, and it either does too little or too much to rank what kind of news it. So this is similarly to Google search. This is a long discussion from the early 2000s onwards. Either there is too little done to rank content or too much done to rank content, and similarly, either there is too little or too much of other people's content in search results, etc. and the like. I think the most important thing for me as a researcher is to try to bring evidence to this discussion so that other people can make up their minds from their own values and their own principles what they think the right response is to this. That's not my role as a researcher to tell people how to think. What I would say is that I think the discussion around whether trust is a useful proxy for trustworthy, I'm perhaps more optimistic and more positive about that development than some people are. I think the results of our survey suggest that people can simultaneously love a content provider, while, as Mark suggests, being actually sort of critical about the veracity and accuracy of the information that it provides. We've known this for a long time in Europe, that tabloid newspapers were widely read, but not actually necessarily trusted even by their own readers. And I don't think there's anything wrong with reading things you can trust. I do it all the time myself. I love entertaining stuff. I love sports, gossip, and rumor and the like. There's nothing wrong with that. The question is, how do you engineer something that allows people to pursue their interests, not only accuracy and factualness or eat your broccoli type information, but make sure that the systems that serve this content at scale do not avoid judgment on veracity or accuracy or trustworthiness when it comes to truly important things, the action results and the like. And I think there is a lot of work to be done there still. But I think the work around trust, and we see the Trust Project and the work around the Trust Survey is broadly encouraging.
So now I want to come back to you because we've just heard these platforms talking about categorization, elevating, quality news, etc. You had some fairly sharp things to say about that, particularly in relation to Facebook's recent categorization.
Yeah, and I'm afraid so. I mean, and I contrasted in that talk between the kind of dialogue, the constructive dialogue we've had with Google. Plenty of issues with Google. There's plenty more we want to talk about, but constructive, and the level of the lack of substantive progress with Facebook. I mean, people know here that on the topic of the approach Facebook is taking to advertising on the Facebook platform and the news providers, and the attempt, first order attempt to blur and treat news providers as if they were parties or advocates. The 7 journalism industry bodies representing 20,000 publications are now involved in this. These publications from around the world. Campbell wrote a blog yesterday saying many publishers are happy. I'd love to meet one. We've got 20,000 unhappy publishers. Facebook, despite the fact that no so many publishers are unhappy, they've implemented already a model of this. And I thought if you've got a slide, I'll give you an example of what's actually happening on the ground here. So I'm going to show you a couple of ads. New York Times ads on the Facebook platform, which have been rejected by the Facebook algorithm and placed in a public archive, which is for ads with political content. This is now for anyone, and the dangerous political thing you're looking at there is a pistachio and rosewater semolina.
It's quite radicalised.
It may be slightly elitist. I want to say the cake may contain nuts. Frankly, Facebook may contain nuts. It does not, to my understanding, contain political content. When we think about the excellence of algorithms, their ability to help in the matter of editorial decision making. Now, to be fair to Facebook, we pointed this out and taken it out of the political archive. But the extent to which the machine can mistake that for politics gives you some idea about the subtlety of what's going on here. If you look at the next slide, which is a more typical one, another rejected ad. Here is an ad which is featuring a New York Times news story. Trump pulls out of North Korean summit meeting with Kim Jong-un. But what I want to say, this has been rejected, and this is now in the ads with political content. We have a fundamental objection to the idea that reporting, I mean, I absolutely accept Donald Trump is a politician, I accept that what he does is politics. But to blur reporting of politics with politics itself is, as I said a couple of days ago, like saying that articles about pornography they contain pornography. That's how it works. There's a distinction between capturing and reporting at arm's length an activity and being part of the activity. And our news reporting strives and has got a long history of striving to be impartial and dispassionate, and is different fundamentally as a category between the actual activity of politics itself. Moreover, it's completely clear that the enemies of high quality journalism want to blur the line. They want to blur the difference between arm's length reporting of politics and politics itself. They say there's no difference. And I'm afraid unintentionally, this is not about Facebook's intentionality. Unintentionally, I'm afraid Facebook is supporting the enemies of high quality journalism. Campbell.
Thank you. It's a fundamental misunderstanding of what we're doing on the platform. And so I think I should start by explaining it. We, given what happened in the last election, made a decision that we would move toward more transparency of all advertising on Facebook. That we would share and archive who was paying for the ads, that they would be labeled and say paid for by, so that information would be publicly searchable. Anybody could go and see who was advertising about what. Because of what happened in the last election, because the focus was around politics, around fake news, our starting addressing transparency focused on all advertising that contains political content or issues. Now, obviously, we recognize there is a distinction between news content about politics and political or advocacy advertising. These are very different things. I was a journalist for 25 years. I think I know the difference. So what we did was create a distinction, a differentiation within the archive, where there is an archive that says news content, there's a separate archive that says political advocacy content. I don't think there's any blurring there. The information is very clear and very transparent for anybody who is interested in seeing who is advertising on our platform. This is the first time that I have heard journalists argue against transparency. Mark, I'm not finished. I'm not. You are exactly arguing against transparency. We're asking you to be transparent about all the content that you boost on the platform. We are going to be doing this with all of our advertising. We believe that this is really important for people to understand. And the idea that somehow we are conflating with two separate archives that are clearly labeled advocacy or politics and journalism is completely false. People are smarter than that. What conflates advocacy and journalism is when journalists do advocacy. And that's happening a lot.
But that's not necessarily what we saw there. And that was not a piece of advocacy by the New York Times.
I'm not suggesting it was. It was a piece of news content. We're talking about Trump. That was a boosted piece of news content about politics. We think that should be transparent. We want everything to be transparent.
So isn't one of the problems here, and I think this is something as well which Erica and Lydia might have their views on as well, is that there is in general a blurring distinction by all parts of the equation here. So I think most people will be, as they were during the disclosure of what Russian propaganda was, most people were really shocked to see that something that they consider as an article is treated as an ad, because they probably don't know that the New York Times actually pays me to see that. So, you know, and we increasingly have a blurred distinction between what's editorial and what's advertising, even within news organisations. Obviously not by quoting news organisations like yours, but Mark, can I just allow Mark to say?
But if I may say so, that's a different distinction. You can debate that or not debate that. But this is not about the boundary between it. This is about the underlying thing. That is a New York Times article. It happens that we want to put it in front of you because we hope to encourage you to read more Times articles. But it's a Times news article. And I really want to pick away at this. Yesterday, Cameron, in her blog, says, as she said now, we recognised immediately, she wrote, that news content was different than political and issue advertising. This isn't true. It just isn't true. What happened in reality is Facebook came to us and they said, from now on, we're going to have to label all of your content. A political ad paid for by the New York Times. That was going to be a label on everything from the Times was going to be a political ad. And so this idea, there's never been any distinction. It's completely blurred in Facebook's head. It's completely blurred in Facebook's head, which is why, and quite honestly, Cameron, why you've now got 20,000 publishers around the world, and they're a file up. If you think this is going to help Facebook, it's about the election. It's about Cambridge Analytica, and it's about a catalogue of horrendous mistakes that Facebook did, which, to be fair, you know, Mark Zuckerberg and others have admitted the scale of what went wrong. Trying to put it right this way is just going to dig you deeper into the hole, isn't it?
Yeah, this kind of, what I hear is we're all for transparency from Facebook, except when it applies to us. Hey, no, Mark, you just got to talk.
We're happy that every single advert from the New York Times be labelled as an ad from the New York Times.
That's what it's labeled as. It's labeled as a piece of content paid for by the New York Times in an archive that says news content. And I just wonder whether this is not about the New York Times not wanting to be transparent about the money they spend, how much money they spend, how they do their marketing. I mean,
to be clear, we're completely happy with total transparency about all aspects of our marketing. What we don't want to do is for Facebook to set itself up as a judge around what political content consists of. Not painfully clear, you don't understand.
Let's stop up there, and Lydia.
I mean, I don't want this to be a pylon, but having heard all of that,
It's her birthday.
Right. But I mean, and this is, this is not about you, Campbell, but I sat in a room where Mark Zuckerberg used phrases like broadly trusted and common ground in a way that, frankly, to me felt downright Orwellian. I don't want trust to be a popularity contest decided by users on Facebook. The idea that this organization would be somehow deciding who's trusted and who's not. I mean, we're living in an environment right now where one segment of the United States population essentially doesn't trust anyone but Fox News. So if we're going to take the entire population of Facebook and use that to decide what's broadly
correct. This is, again, just a misunderstanding of how this works. Our broadly trusted survey of people on the platform is one of thousands of signals that go into determining what shows up in a person's newsfeed. It's not like, oh, well, the Huffington Post is broadly trusted, they're going to be in your newsfeed, and the New York Times isn't broadly trusted, therefore they're not. This is a survey that contributes to many, many different signals that go into making the determination of what appears in someone's newsfeed. So, for example, you mentioned earlier the Trust Project indicators. That's another signal. That's another signal we use to make a determination about what is and isn't quality. We survey people about what they find informative, what they don't find informative. That's another signal. We look at how much time people spend reading a news article. That's another signal. These are all literally thousands of signals determine what appears in your newsfeed. So the idea that Mark's saying, you know what, we're going to start surveying the community and try to add additional signals like, do people find a news organization broadly trusted? It will be one of the thousands that we consider is a good thing. I think we're moving closer and closer toward how we do this, but it is the idea that this is a determination about whether a given news organization rises or falls on newsfeed is just not how newsfeed works. I mean, it's not how our algorithm works. And I just listening to you both and the misunderstanding that exists here makes me think that honestly, we're just not doing a very good job of explaining ourselves on these issues, and that we need to be much more aggressive and much more out there about trying to clear up what are real misunderstandings.
So on this basis, okay, so promise wrestling. So on this basis of who decides, who gets to decide, who constructs, what comes next for journalists, it seems clear to me that actually Facebook, I mean, there's part of Facebook, I'm sure, that would just quite like all of these publishers to get off the platform, maybe.
No, not true at all. I think the community, I mean, look, it's part of our mission that we want to have an informed community. Right. That means having high quality news on the platform. But
do we know what high quality news means? I mean,
and that's hard, trying to define it. Well, that's why you want so many signals to help you make that determination.
Again, I mean, I think that there has been a strong focus, understandably, on from the top of people at Facebook on two kinds of news, right? Local news and investigative reporting, and those two are held up as being the kind of paragon of the most important, virtuous. Those are great forms of journalism. There are lots of other kinds of journalism out there that need support as well, right, and that people want to read and people want to engage with. And so this is another thing, and again, I'm not saying that you're just only going to force local news and investigative journalism down people's throats, but we all live rich and complicated lives, and the idea that like these two forms of journalism are the ones that sort of pass the smell test and everything else can just kind of,
Well, there's also the question that is Sinclair Media, which is now local news.
That's a great point. I mean, local news scores, local television news scores at the absolute top in your findings, both in terms of what's a news source that you've used in the last week. I'm proud to say that Post was #1 in digital news sources in the United States. But in terms of what's a broadcast and print, local news was #1, and in trust, local news counts as #1. So local TV news. So I mean, I think to me that is a on fire question for us. Is what does the future of local television news in this country look like? I spent many weeks crossing the country last year and frequently stopped and did interviews on the local newscast. And did you ever work in local TV news?
I did. Yeah, 3 local stations.
So you know how deeply trusted that connection is between the local TV anchor, the local TV reporters, and that community, the type of service journalism that they provide. So the idea of that being co-opted and perverted by political agendas, having them sandwiched into the report about the parade and the weather and the traffic is, to me, probably the most terrifying thing in journalism right now.
Erica, because in a minute I'm going to attack Erica because nobody else is. Okay.
I can attack Google.
No. I was going to say that one of the announcements we made in March was about authoritativeness. So one of the things that was happening is during breaking news situations on the top UI of Google, top stories, for example, relevance was what was bringing content or showcasing content immediately after breaking news event. And we know that it takes news organizations, I don't know, 5, 10, 15 minutes to verify a story. And it takes perhaps conspiracy theorists a bit less time. So we've begun to look at authoritativeness as a signal of quality. And I think that's, could be very nuanced if you add on top of that, like what the Trust Project has been doing is finding. So proximity, who funds the news organization? Do they have an ethics policy? And so there's this whole world of Trust Project signals that we think are really important, and then we've supported them for multiple years to figure this out outside of Google. Then there's also just this move to understand authority, and when authority is important over relevance, and so that's something that's going to be continually developed. But I'll say this, that right now, part of the signal authority is what publishers self-select to be a part of the Google News corpus, and things like that. But I do think ultimately this is about transparency, and we on the platform side, the very different platforms, we do need to be having much more open conversation about how decisions are made and how we view these things, because ultimately that will actually build trust in the ethics, certainly inside of Google, and importance of how we think about these things.
Well, one thing that both of your organisations could do is just open up and have much more available in your APIs. If you're trying to study Google AMP, it's really difficult. You have to do manual collection on this. It sort of feels as though the opportunity to kind of introduce that transparency is there, but not everybody really wants to do it.
Well, this is what we should talk about for the GNI. There will be, we hope to involve a lot of researchers. So literally, Emily, this is something we should have an open conversation about with you and other leading researchers. What are the things that need to be opened up? And this is the moment to have those conversations.
So, Mark, I want to come back to you because it's, again, something you said at the Open Markets Initiative on Tuesday, where you really talked about, again, why are we constantly focusing on trust? It's not actually a particularly useful metric in constructing an open market for news. Now, one of the questions I think for the entire panel is, is it even possible to think about an open market now, given how people's behaviour, given the fact that everything is concentrated in quite small screens? What is we complain a lot as journalists and exactly what are the solutions to this?
Well, I think if you start with a kind of citizen-centric view of the world, the most important things, it seems to me, is that you've got an economic environment which is sufficiently strong that it makes literally the kind of activity of journalism to a decent standard, escalated local, national, whatever, makes that possible. But also that there are multiple different points of editorial decision making and accountability, so that a citizen, in a sense, can over time choose between those points about who to believe. So I think trust is incredibly important, but I think trust should be formulated for all the reasons that Rasmus said earlier on. In the mind of the citizen, given genuine choice, and obviously the risk. I want to say each news organisation itself should be profoundly transparent. We're completely happy with all of our marketing data on Facebook to be made available. We're not ashamed, but we're happy to see all of that. But more generally, that our process should be transparent. And at New York Times, there is an editor. You can find out where it is. You can see him. You can sue the organisation. We've just done a 4-part documentary fly on the wall about how our the fourth estate on Showtime. The ad for which, by the way, was blocked by the Facebook algorithm. I can show you that one as well. But there needs to be the worry about the big platforms, particularly, and I'm afraid to say, like Lydia, I'd say Mark Zuckerberg's remarks, which I know come from the heart and are intended to help, make my blood run cold when he starts talking about how he thinks about community and about broadly trusted. I think these are terrifyingly naive perspectives on news. But the issue, not just for Facebook, for Google, is in the end, making a bit available to researchers, being prepared to talk about algorithms isn't enough, given how important these are becoming, and given the risk in the end that these machines and machine-led black boxes become more determinative of what people look at and read than human editors. It's vital we not just understand how they work, but they themselves can be exposed and interrogated and ultimately are available for politicians and others to take a view on. Part of our society, it's far too central to democracy and politics to be left to a kind of set of proprietary ideas and different weightings and all that.
What about the idea that actually we're just reconstructing plurality, and that's what I'd like to sort of hear your views on this, that we're just reconstructing a different type of plurality where the gatekeepers are slightly different. Gatekeepers maybe in the AT&T and the Facebook and everything is actually just moving away from one set of, forgive me, Mark, white men to another set largely of.
I have to say, it's incredibly refreshing to be on this panel as well. So well done on that front. But
we try our best.
So I want to say, I absolutely do not believe that the New York Times or other legacy media should have some kind of armor on this. And I think that the arrival of many new entrants, we don't call it new anymore, but the arrival of digital entrants every day, new people coming on, that's a good thing, not a bad thing. I think, however, if we thought that 10 years from the time there was going to be fewer than 4 or 5 global gatekeepers, we would worry. We've got 20,000 publishers who are represented by the 7 industries. So we still have a lot of structural plurality. And if we accept that because of the way technology is going, the numbers of centers of decision making, because lots of legacy media is going to go bust, has gone bust, and because of consolidation, aggregation of the very big players, I think plurality is the biggest single risk I think we face.
Great. Rasmus, you see this as it were through an academic lens and also through a political lens, because you're a professor of political communications at Oxford as well. Is not right that sort of plurality is as big a threat as he says it is? This kind of this new world order, is it desirable? Is it inevitable?
I mean, first, I think a premise I think we probably should establish for this conversation is that while there are many reasons to be concerned and many concerns that we should seriously discuss as a society, and I'm glad that Mark and others are right in raising them, I do not know a single person under 40 who would rather have the media environment that I grew up with in the 1990s than the one we have today. And if they want it, I am happy to take them to the provinces, the outer reaches of Denmark, and show them what that's like to live in a small village with access to one regional newspaper and very little else. Now, that environment then, is plurality present there? In one sense, absolutely yes. I mean, we live in a world in which essentially 2 organizations, Google and Facebook, serve news to more people than any organization done in the history of mankind. And the way in which they shoulder that responsibility is absolutely decisive. In fact, then, when we look at how they have shouldered that responsibility, the most rigorous, independent, evidence-based research I know of, in fact, suggests, and this is not only us at the Reuters Institute, but many other people too, in fact suggests that discovery through social media and search increases the diversity of people's news consumption. It does not reduce it. The filter bubble hypothesis was a really important and urgently pressing question, and Neil was brilliantly pointing at it and putting us to us. But at this stage, and it's one we should keep asking that question, at this stage, the evidence suggests that in fact, social media and search drives diverse discovery. It incrementally increases political participation and civic engagement, and importantly, it does so particularly powerfully so for those least interested in news and for young people. So in a society in which that's embarrassing. Sorry. In a society in which so many other forces are increasing inequality, I think it's actually critically important to appreciate at this moment the way in which the major platforms operate, in fact, seems to somewhat counterweigh these tendencies. Now, are there other considerations? Absolutely yes. Around diversity, including their role in the market, in terms of advertising, for example, and including their role in the amount of data and talent and the like that they are accumulating. Absolutely yes, and I'm glad we're having this discussion. I think what's important as we have this discussion is essentially sort of 2 things. One is that we try to have on the basis some sort of evidence, so it's not basis of moral panic entrepreneurs advancing, the latest assertive, utterance about what the world might be like in this space, but we have to try to understand, because these things are so important, let's at least try to understand what's actually going on. We would never build a bridge just because someone said we should in a particular way. We try to understand it first before we do it. These questions are too big, too important
to address them in a different fashion. So evidence first. The second one is that I think we need to accept that there are no solutions in this space. We live in irreducibly diverse societies where we have different values. And we will not agree on how to do this. It's too big and too important. I think we see just on the panel, we see different principle points of view. And that's why I think it's so important that we not only bring evidence to this discussion, but also that we appreciate that we move away from this way in which the discussion played out for too long, with sort of unilateral pronouncements from individual companies, and to a forum like this, where I really appreciate it's uncomfortable to have a sort of a spiky conversation around this, perhaps particularly uncomfortable on your birthday. But it's also really important, and I think it's really, really a sign of maturation, if you will, from companies as well as the community as a whole, that we now actually can disagree in public and try to help each other understand, and then arrive each of us in the room on the basis of our own values. What do you think this should look like? I mean, I may have my own views, but what do you think? Right, this is the collective conversation we need to have now.
I'm going to ask them what they think in about 2 minutes, so get your questions ready. But on that point, and this is where I'm getting this Lydia's help to push back on you. You're right that actually in some ways the friction that we've seen between New York Times and Facebook seems entirely healthy. Facebook is an enormous structure of power in economic terms, in civil terms, etc. But not as big as Google, which has its tentacles absolutely everywhere. And I said the other day, you know, the fact that Google is getting really favourable ratings from news organisations is great for that particular relationship. But, you know, is it healthy when we have something like Report for America, which is only partially supported by Google, Google has no direct control over it, is putting reporters into newsrooms in areas where Google is also selling software solutions to town halls, schools, etc., putting self-driving cars on the road. I just worry, as a complete outsider to this world now, that that relationship is just too cozy, or it is in danger of becoming too cozy. The conflicts of interest are really significant. I'm looking at this, you're in a, you know, you're going to pile on to Google, maybe not in that way, but is there a danger that you are all a little bit too catchy? You can say no.
I think there's a tremendous danger. That said, if Google wants to write a blog post to check. No, I think there is a tremendous danger in co-option and in, you know, look, there's a lot of kind of scar tissue among these organizations who've collaborated with the platforms. You know, you spin up Facebook Live, you spin up this thing or that thing that they're supporting, and then they stop supporting it, which is fine. It's their business, up to them whether to do it. But I think any news organization that's depending on an experimental handout from a platform company is doing it wrong. That's not, and I think, you know, Ken would agree with me on that, right? I mean, I think many news organizations declined to take part in the newest Facebook Watch for precisely that reason, that they just looked at the terms and said, this doesn't work for us, and walked away. And I think there is a tremendous problem in the concentration of power, but to me, the much bigger problem is in the concentration of economic power of these platforms. Do we really want a world in which, you know, 90% of advertising revenue is sucked up by two companies? And I think the answer to that is probably no.
Yeah, sure. I'm going to let Erica make more questions.
Well, I guess just on the, I mean, listen, these are really good questions and they're important questions. You're raising about independence of places that we are funding, and so we should have that conversation. Report for America, let's talk about that, and let's talk about the Google Fellowships that we've been doing for years. Google Fellowships is a good example. We have fellows around the world, and they're selected by the organizations that are, you know, going to have the fellow. They pick their own projects. We have absolutely nothing to do with the selection. And in fact, Neiman's a great example. Neiman's had a Google Fellow for years ever since it started, and they totally report on us in ways that hold us accountable. So the fact that you're asking that question is important because it means that we should talk about that more, and we should, like, you know, share these principles about the church and state of, like, when we give money away, there's, like, total independence. And frankly, we really care about independent reporting, and we think we should be held to account too. So it's our expectation when we do give away money like that, and in that sense, like Report for America, that those organizations are independent to cover the way that they should, and that they will.
So there are just two quick points I want to make. There's a fundamental tension that I think is always going to exist between media companies and tech companies when we try to partner with each other. You know, media companies need stability. In order to build a business over the long term, they need to know what's coming. Technology companies are exactly the opposite. They want to change, they want to innovate, they want to change constantly. And I think we haven't been great in the past about just being really upfront with partners who want to experiment with us about how thrashy and rocky a ride this is going to be. So we're trying now, for example, with Facebook Watch, where we're funding new shows, to say, look, this might not work. So if you come on board, know that this may not work. But if you're game to experiment, we'll fund it because we all want to find new formats, new ways to tell stories, and a lot of news organizations don't have resources laying around to be able to experiment with these new ideas. So if we can help them try new things, and it may not work, none of it may work, but I do think when we're trying to reach a new generation of people who are not consuming news the same way, we have to have some sort of format where we can test and try and experiment new ways of doing it. And then just the broader point, I get that, like, you know, this is affecting Mark's business, our decision around political ads. I understand that. And no, okay, well then not. But it's something you're deeply concerned about, Mark. I hear you.
Right.
But when we make this decision, I think you have to take a step back. I hear Mark's concern, but this is about the integrity of our election. We have a midterm coming up. You know what happened on our platform during the last election. We have very few ways of like trying to address many of these problems beyond the ones we're already doing, which is trying to tackle the fake accounts. But by just opening up the everything and being as transparent as possible around the advertising that takes place on the platform. And that's what we're doing. We're trying to throw it all up. That way, reporters can search a publicly available database of everything that's out there. And the reason it's focused on political content and content around issues is because that's what was at the heart of the last election. It wasn't about Target trying to sell laundry detergent. It was about politics.
Just very quick question, but it's just like not much better done by human beings. I mean, it doesn't seem like it's that hard.
You mean the review process?
Yeah. I mean,
sure. I mean, like capturing a cooking thing is a bug, and those things are going to happen, and we're going to have to fix them. But I don't see what's wrong with saying the New York Times paid for a boost to the story about Donald Trump. There it is. You can see it. You know it. There's nothing wrong with that, and we label it in an archive that says news content. So that's what he's opposed to, that we label it in an archive that says news content, not an archive that says political content. That's a different place. You have to go search somewhere else for that. But in an archive that says news content, I have a really hard time understanding why the transparency of having your ads, your boosted content appear there is such a problem. And this is, like, I view my job as to advocate for news organizations within a really big company with a lot of competing interests. But on this issue, I just think you're wrong. I just think you're wrong. I've been pushing like crazy for Facebook to be more transparent, and I'm gonna keep pushing, and it's gonna impact a lot of people, but I do think it's the right thing to do.
So, thank goodness I can turn it over to the audience. I'm going to start at left. If you can just say who you are, because I think I know who a lot of you are, but lots of other people don't. And as somebody said the other day, make sure there's a question mark at the end of whatever it is you're saying.
Absolutely. My name is Tommaso Reyes. I'm Director of Partnerships with the News Literacy Project, which is partnered with many of the organizations represented on the stage. Obviously, the media and technology landscape is very different from when most of the people in this room grew up, but the way that we're teaching our young people about how to deal and interact and understand the media environment or the information landscape isn't. So obviously, I have a bias, but how important is media literacy, news literacy, information literacy in terms of solving the demand side of the problem, making sure that people are aware that, hey, that was a great piece, but that's an opinion piece, that's not a news piece. Or when I see 5 people arguing on CNN or MSNBC or Fox, there's not very little news content there that's actually opinion. How, in terms of technology companies and media companies, can we address the supply side of that?
Can I plug a project too?
Yeah.
Yes, in a minute.
Well, to Google, it's very important. I mean, we just announced a $3 million grant to the Poynter Institute working with Stanford. I think your project is amazing too. What Stanford is doing, and why we were so compelled by their research, is like, we need to teach people critical reasoning skills. So it is like, sure, if you see an article, it's like, we've seen this stuff of like, ask yourself these 10 questions. Like, that's good. We also need to like get in there earlier and say, you know, educate them on like how to think like a fact checker. And that's some of the research they've done, where they've like given students at different ages websites to look at, and they said, okay, tell us if this is trustworthy or not. And a lot of those students and people stay on the same page, and they read and they look at the citations, as opposed to what fact checkers do, which is they do lateral reading. They start going, pulling up other stuff. They see who's the source, who pays for this, etc. We just have to like be much more invested and use more of our resources to do exactly what you're doing. So it's hugely important to Google, and you'll see more coming from that.
Google, I know Google has been doing a lot on this, and it's like, this is one of the things that isn't always as sexy as the fake news stuff and everything else, and so it doesn't get as much attention. But we are partnering with you all on developing a curriculum to get to schools around news and digital literacy, and it's. I'm so glad you're doing it. Facebook is funding it; they're doing all the work. But it's about building this muscle that I don't think any of us needed to have, which is we just didn't have that many sources of news, so we didn't have to be as discerning as our children do. I mean, I have 2 kids; they're going to grow up literally, you know, probably never opening a textbook in their lives. Every bit of information they get is going to take. I'm sorry. That's how old I am today. Emily, but it's giving them
I was just reflecting on my own children.
Giving them the skills to be discerning about different kinds of news and know the questions to ask is something they need to learn, and we don't teach it at school. So developing these curriculums, which is what the News Literacy Project is doing, is I think pretty incredible.
Well, if I can just say, I think that I talked about this a couple of days ago. One of the issues we've got is a lot of the signals to audiences which are available. You know, if you turn literally to the physical opinion page of the newspaper, you know you're in a different realm. It's about a platform for debate rather than a news story, or a cable news TV show where it's obviously a discussion framing a political subject. We've lost those signals. I'm not blaming anyone for this. I think those signals aren't as apparent, particularly when you're in a social feed or you're looking at a stream of Google App stores or whatever. And I think we need to work together to put those signals back. I think the best people to put signals back, by the way, are the originating publishers. We know what the intentionality is. And I think a lot of the supposed problem about distinguishing news from politics, which is around opinion, can be clarified. And I'd be very much up for a conversation with Facebook and everyone about how we put labels in ourselves so that the user knows exactly what's the status of this. I mean, the Times has got a history of being a platform for ideas and debate going back 150 years. You know, our traditional readers are used to it. We need to get our new readers used to the idea. These are ideas that stimulate you. It's different from news, but we can do that.
If I may just add one more thing, I do think that we've long overestimated people's discernment, even in the print era. I remember when I was a young reporter at the New York Times, and they explained to me that the way that you know the difference between a straight news article and a news analysis is one is justified, bragging, right? And I was like, oh, that'll make it clear.
I love the words justified, bragging, right?
Right. I've never forgot it. But and I think we should remember that that this is actually a really
Right, absolutely. Now, I'm not deliberately ignoring Jeff Johnson, I am tonight.
We're always going to Jeff.
I'm going to take the also question from here, and question over there, and then.
Mike Miller, I'm currently unemployed, but soon to be a fellow at the Social Science Research Council Media and Democracy Project. And my question is for Lydia. Earlier you cited a statistic that said something to the effect only 25% of people would be willing to pay for a subscription. It seemed to suggest that was too low. And so my question is, it's not a rhetorical question. It's just, I have no, it's right, but what would be an appropriate number? And if this, which you seem to suggest that, we're moving towards a model where most people should expect that journalism subscriptions are like a staple expenditure. Is that putting an undue burden on a particular segment of the society, especially in societies such as ours, where there's gross disparities in wealth and disposable?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating question, and I think that the proportion of Americans who have directly paid for news has always been pretty small. I don't know. I don't know the historical data, but I'm guessing that more people are paying directly for news now than they did. I actually don't know the answer to that question. I shouldn't speculate. But the reality is that a lot of people pay indirectly for news. Let's say you have a cable bundle. Part of that cable bundle is going to support, a little tiny sliver of it is going to support the newsroom of CNN, of NBC, and all. So people do pay for news in indirect ways that I assume is not captured in this. One of the people directly paying for news comes from, it is inspired in many ways by the fantastic work that the New York Times has done in this area, and I used to work there, and I'm a huge fan of the organization, and a huge supporter of it. And one of the things that we often talked about was the curious reader and how important it is that the Times reader is not just an affluent person, it's any person who's curious. And I think that that's actually a great way to think about who the ideal consumer of the great product of the New York Times is. And how post I ask a different question is, and that is, what about the incurious? What about people who don't think that news is important to their lives? Young people who discover news because they happen across it or they search for it. And so it's not like the most inspiring slogan in the world, but like, work for the incurious. People who don't know that they need to be informed. I'm kind of kidding, but not really. I mean, how can I do this? See, you've already improved upon our slogan. So I do think a lot about this question, and Josh Beckman, the News Lab, that talks about the unused and the underused as a kind of similar to the unbanked and the underbanked, and people who are thinking about news consumers who are never going to pay for news, people who are not particularly news literate. I think those are really important. That's like a huge population, not just in the United States, but around the world. And I've spent the last 18 months of my life thinking in great detail and kind of endlessly and with considerable frustration about how to serve quality news to those audiences that frankly are probably never going to pay for news.
Sure. Rasmus,
I mean,
actually, Rasmus, also, you said 7% in the UK, but obviously, I don't know whether or not you deduped it from, say, the license fee. Well,
otherwise, a lot of people would be in jail. Thanks for raising the question. I think it's a pretty important one. And let me first say, I believe strongly in the value of journalism. It's public importance, all that stuff. But here comes the but, and a bit of tough love. And I'm not saying this is the other part of your question, but a lot of news publishers, when they talk about paying for news, what they effectively mean is that we think people should pay for what we already do. This is about pricing the product on basis of what it costs to produce. We are not making money, therefore you should pay. This is not sound business advice, right? I think, I think this is where we need to start, right? There is a question: how does news create value for people, for actual people out there, not people who come to us like this, people outside, people 20 blocks from here, 25 blocks. How does news create value for people? What are the problems it solves? And how can we convince people that it solves those problems? And then when we see the numbers, I think it behooves us to think about the question of social inequality, and truly for truly disadvantaged communities and poor people, of course money is a consideration. But I would say also this, that when you look at, for example, Bureau of Labor Statistics data on consumer expenditures, the amount of money Americans spend on media has declined over time as a percentage of their income, also amongst poor people. And when we've done in the UK interviews with people who are what we call news avoiders, the people who in our surveys say that they have not consumed any professionally produced journalism in the last month, which by the way is about 7% in this country. That's a high number. We ask them about their media habits. They use Netflix, they have a smartphone, they have a data subscription line. They spend quite a lot of money on media. They don't spend any time with news, and they don't spend any money on news. Why? Well, because they do not feel that news creates any value for them. It doesn't make their life better in any way. In fact, it often makes their life worse. They find that it is depressing, they find that it is disempowering, they find it increased their alienation. It's the kind of thing that they would not let their children watch. Okay? I mean, this is a really, really serious question for journalism. Like, what is the problem that you solve, and who do you solve it for? And that has to be the starting point for any conversation around pay. What's the value you create? And then you can talk about how to capture it.
Isn't journalism, though, like good government? It should work when people are not paying attention to it, and that's one of the problems that we have. It has to do something that be transactional as opposed to just functioning.
I mean, sorry, and it's very quickly that would be nice, but that's not the world we live in. If it was, we would have good governance everywhere.
I definitely think that I mean, it's actually right, but there's a real risk for most publishers focusing on the end of the story, which is can you get digital advertising to work, can you get a subscription business to work? That's not the right central question. The right central question is about can you, by offering genuinely relevant, valuable content to users in a way and at the moment and on a platform that puts them there, can you build their engagement over time? If you can build the engagement, we can figure out, kind of finer point. If you've got engagement, you've got fundamental, experience and the value which the user's getting, which then, our thesis is partly about subscription. We call ourselves subscription first, but it's not saying subscription is the answer on its own. We've got a podcast which is been monetized in a quite different way and is getting a different kind of engagement. We announced a big TV show with FX and Hulu. Again, it's got different monetization. It's essentially a license fee, and it will reach very possibly a different group of people in a different way. So, to me, the heart of it is relevance. And exactly as Andrew says, the fatal mistake is to assume you've got a legacy fixed business and it's somebody else's job to pay for it without you changing it. And I think all over the world we can see that kind of conservatism failing this.
Question over there. And back over here.
Good afternoon. I'd like to start by saying thank you. I'd like to start by saying happy birthday. And into Facebook, I'm one of those folks who have received a scholarship from the Facebook Journalism Project, which makes it possible for why I'm here. And my name is Randy Jenner, and I'm an extract student. And I've been focusing on management. My question has to do with more evidence or something that you're doing, and perhaps it's more a question for students. There were 3 items that I picked up as a kind of bullishness for the future messaging, which to me is a great example of work in its recent ability to make native advertising and get a real revenue booster for them. And then you mentioned audio, which of course strikes me as a student because we get boot camp in August, on audio and how to make that usefully. And then the third one was so is this based on what's the criteria on the bullishness of this one? Is it about economic power? Is it about trustworthiness? Is there some sort of Nordic specialness that you claim came upon that brings you to that these conclusions?
Thank you for the question about the research.
Yeah, okay, so quickly to that, thanks for picking up on some of those simple points. I mean, essentially, I'm trying to look for the areas where there's potential. I mean, we know that the media business and the media practice of the 1990s are fading fast because we do no longer live in the 1990s. And I think we should think about the future. Where is the potential? Where are the new opportunities? And I think the areas that you mentioned are examples of where we see the opportunity for that sweet spot, that overlap between ways of doing journalism that reaches people in a context that makes sense to them, that's convenient, accessible, compelling for them, solves problems for them, makes their lives better, and perhaps in a way that they're willing to pay for, either through a subscription or another way through donation or membership. So just holding these up as new opportunities, because as Mark rightly said, and I'm glad that this is not the center of the conversation here, but in many conversations like this, the center of the conversation often is, what can we do to solve the problem? And the problem is defined as getting back to the revenues of the 1990s. And if that is the problem, then there's no solution, because we no longer live in a world of no choice for the consumer and high market power for publishers. We live in a world of high choice for the consumer and low market power for the publishers. So we have to think about what is the situation we're in today, and where are the opportunities for the future, for the practice of journalism, for those of you who are journalists or aspire to be journalists, but also for the business that can be done. So we've just pulled some of these out as the areas that we think are exciting, where we see many examples of innovation. For example, in the global south, organizations like Radler and Politico in Mexico, The Wire in India, organizations are very bullish about their abilities to leverage platform powers to reach people, to create value in their lives, and get them to either donate or pay for that journalism.
Jeff Jarvis.
I'm Jeff Jarvis, and I'm proud to say that I'm from the Franklin Mark Graduate School of Journalism. One question for the non-platform folks, for Lydia and Mark and Rasmus. I'm about to start a project trying to aggregate the signals of quality and lack thereof, external signals, besides things that platforms already do. Because I think that we in journalism need to help them make better decisions about promoting quality, both in terms of attention and in terms of advertising. I'll also take this on the platforms, but also to ad companies. So my question is, what are the signals of quality in journalism that you would wish, besides your own brands, that you would wish that both platforms, technology companies, and advertisers would use to try to push toward resources in terms of promotion, attention, and advertising?
So I'm nervous about the whole direction of travel here. I can come up, anyone could, with list of, numbers of journalists employed and so on. But I think that we're comfortable with the idea of fighting our corner and trying to win our audiences in very open environments like Facebook and the big wide, internet as a whole, and to stand on our reputation and to convince users one by one by their experience of our journey. We do what we do. And I mean, this stuff is difficult and dangerous, in my view, to algorithms to somehow imagine this could be codified. We have one simple suggestion, is there are a number of well-established industry bodies which gather groups of publishers together. The list of the members of those industries is one possible aggregation, not necessarily in quotes by journalism, but well-established, properly vetted organisations with addresses, with named individuals there. And there's no reason, by the way, if someone's excluded from one of those associations, create a new association. I mean, so one way this has happened since time immemorial is industrial organisation with certain standards, and so you actually get profession organising standards. One of the issues with our dialogue with Facebook won't talk to our industry associations. I think actually we would probably get to a solution if we had a substantial conversation between the industry associations and Facebook. And we think that therefore organising, and be quite clear, not saying it's just going to be an ACD, if new entrants want to have their own organisations, that's fine. So I'm reluctant to surrender a list of kind of automatic signals which taken together demonstrate trust. And I think history tells us that it's a complicated thing, trust. And there are times of kind of majority error when mainstream media gets it wrong and it's some untrusted outlier who's got the truth. Often mainstream media gets it right. And I'm just really loath to have sheep and goats moment, no matter how virtuous, and nobody more virtuous than you, Jeff, is the person who's the
I'm
shower.
not sure about that.
Can I just respond to three sentences? I'm one person and I have a small team, and so in our conversations with people, I find it's better to talk to publishers than to their lobbyists, because you tend to get the straight story and things don't get lost in translation. If you would prefer I talk to your lobbyist more going forward, I will do so. But I just, from my perspective, in trying to solve problems and solve them quickly, getting a whole bunch of publishers together in the room is a lot more effective.
I mean, you spend the whole session talking about the gulf understanding on this topic, not just with us, but with many publishers and with our entire industry, certainly the overwhelming part of the industry. I think just since I have a mic, the idea that Facebook is being transparent is ludicrous. It's ludicrous. It is not. Maybe Facebook is going to become a transparent organization. It's worth remembering Cambridge Analytica. Facebook's first reaction when the Cambridge Analytica story surfaced was to take legal action to attempt to get it suppressed. And the kind of Mickey Mouse world in which Facebook is in favor of transparency and publishers aren't is nonsensical. We're completely comfortable to be transparent about our marketing on Facebook. But the idea that Facebook currently operates in a transparent way is ludicrous.
I didn't suggest that, Mark. I think we have a lot to do in terms of trying to be far, far more transparent. So I know you're wound up. I just want to say that we're moving toward transparency in our advertising, and that's what we're fighting for. Yeah.
I just want to respond to the next question. Yeah, I mean, I'm very much in Mark's camp on this question. I would rather wait for, governments to regulate large unaccountable companies rather than give the tools to those companies to regulate us. I think that's, I wouldn't want to give any ammunition to these places to say, oh, here, we've agreed that you're the sheriff, and these are the rules by which we're all going to play. I think I think that would be suicidal on our part. Our independence, our identities require us to think of ourselves as having our credibility judged not by our achievements, by the bodies that, it's great to win Pulitzers, it's great to, have big audiences and all those things, but I think we need to grind out trust one user at a time, story by story, video by video, and that's really the only, from my perspective, the only validation that matters.
Right. I think over there, then over here, then. So two bars, less than over here.
I can project out of me.
We might need you on the live stream.
Gabriel Sands, I'm in News and Journalism Partnerships at Reddit. I'm curious to know how you consider discourse on platforms or on your O&O, as the case may be, as a complement to the content that you're either distributing or producing.
That's a great question.
Mark, you should start. Thanks, sir. Great.
Well, I mean, to me, the fundamental object is to try and get a kind of as positive a dialectic as you can between, if you like, the incoming stream of professionally reported and curated content and, public discussion of what that might mean and debate about what that might mean. And, quality control certainly on our own platform, we have very little control over what happens off our platform, but on platform, trying to make sure, we have, going back to Earl of Ox, who bought the paper in 1895, a theory about intelligent and civil debate. And we're pretty ruthless, and if we can't moderate to achieve that, we won't have content. It's like, we've never had a problem. We have advertising from news organizations, we have advertising from advocates, political advocacy, advertising. We've never had a problem distinguishing. We've never had a single complaint about a confusion between news and advocacy, because we're very careful about how we handle advocacy. But the same way with content debate, we want to maintain a standard, but to encourage it. Of course, we want engagement, and one of the ways in which the public can engage with news is to, have opinions about it.
It's interesting because one of the biggest changes that we've made in Compost since I came on board is we actually shut down our open contributor network. For me, that was really important because while it was an extraordinary innovation when it was invented in 2005 and Compost first launched, it was really a sort of signature core part of the brand. Fast forward to 2018, our problem is cacophony, our problem is confusion about, what is news and what's just somebody spouting off. So we've come from, this kind of radical internet roots of a platform for everybody, and have put a much greater emphasis on trying to make it clear to our audience that these are our editorial products, these are the things that we put our name and our brand behind. And I think now that we've reached that equilibrium point where I feel like we've made that known, we do want to get back into that engagement game, having a deeper conversation. And I think it's, I think one of the things that is really admirable about the New York Times is its approach to getting great content from its readers and its commenters, and they're really interesting people. But I think that's something that you build over time with a deeply engaged audience and a very, very strong brand. So I would look to a model like that as something that how we would want to start engaging with our readers now that we've kind of got our own house at work.
So we've got time. I think we can get in. I'll try and get in the remaining questions. So yeah, there. Yes.
Hey, hi. I'm Ben Jackson. I run a consulting firm called Wind. Before that, I was at Vice and the New York Times, and I built some algorithms in my day. And one of the things that stuck out to me was hearing about thousands of signals that go into newsfeed. And the first thing that came to mind was I have no idea how those are weighted. And that goes back to this fundamental question that you all can't open your algorithms to the public without allowing them to be gamed. So here's a question for Mark and Lydia. If you could put yourself in the shoes of the platforms, short of open sourcing your algorithms, what's the first step that you would take to start building a little bit of trust?
Great question. You are, imagine, Mark, you were on Facebook. What would be the first thing you do?
I think this is a difficult problem. I mean, to be honest, if I may say so, fundamentally, it's not as a publisher my problem to solve. But of course,
But you have a lot of opinions on
well, as it happens, I think some of the suggested solutions sound to me worse than the disease, actually. Although I agree with Robert Thompson.
Give us better.
Well, so I worry about having a kind of statutory or judicial algorithm review board, as Robert Thompson of News Corp has suggested. I think that, as it were, handing control of all of this to politicians or their proxies runs its own manifest risks. In a sense, I think, not literally, but one imagines that President Putin and President Xi Jinping already have such boards, as it were, and they control the way algorithms work. But I think, honestly, I want to say the first thing is we may have to, the platforms may have to consider a much simpler approach to news, i.e. fewer signals, public signals, and the algorithm is not the general algorithm. The algorithm, insofar as it deals with content, not continuously changing and optimizing. Some of you might not optimize from time to time, but there are longer periods where it's stable and can be understood. They're going to obviously have to build in protections against gaming. But the idea of a simpler, clearer public set of signals and enough stasis in the algorithm that over a period of year, everyone, the public, politicians, the publishers, platforms themselves, can see how it works, and then the adjustments are public. The ideal is this is essentially public, but voluntary, and that we get something else we should get, which is, as it were, structured competition between the platforms. I hope with civic objectives as well as financial objectives. The other thing, straightforwardly, is taking less money from political advocacy units wouldn't be such a bad plan as well. And what went wrong in the last election wasn't it's not the electoral process. It was the role Facebook played in propagating false news in the election and looking hard at quality control in terms of advocacy and in terms of advertising wouldn't go amiss. What we do at the Times. Now, I know we're dealing with a far smaller quantity of advertising, but the principle that if you don't quality control the advertising, you're going to end up with a problem, I'm afraid is the same.
And just, I have to say one thing, the best way to quality control advertising is to shine a light on it. Transparency.
I'm of the belief that transparency alone is not enough, that one has to be proactive because transparency puts the burden on the consumer rather than on the person who's making the profit from we're going to say transparency, well, let's put this drug out there, see how many people drop dead. It'll be published in the newspaper, and that way we'll all know what not to take. So I actually look at this from a slightly different perspective. I think that news organizations probably should be far less dependent on these platforms in general. But when I look at a platform that I admire and I think is actually playing a positive role in the news ecosystem, I would say Apple is a really good one. Not so much from a publisher perspective, because the monetization is absolutely horrible, although they just turned on DFP, so that's great. And it's interesting because Apple has gone in a completely different direction. They said we are going to make value judgments about what is news and what is not, and we are, going to have an editorial staff that's going to say, yes, Fox News, New York Times, HuffPost. These are news organizations, and we as a company have decided our value is that we want to create a product that that serves people quality news, and we're going to take it upon ourselves to decide what quality news is. We're not going to worry about people squawking about your bias left, bias right. We're just going to bite the bullet and say this is the product. And guess what? People love that product. It's a great product. As a news consumer, I think it's a fantastic product. Now, I'm saying I don't want Facebook to, in an open way, say, okay, this quality thing this thing indicates this level of quality, that indicates that level of quality. But I'm perfectly comfortable with the platform saying, this is our platform, and we've decided that X, Y, Z players are the ones that are allowed to play on it, and they're the ones that we're going to promote. And I think, to me, that feels like the type of platform that is best in tune with my interests as a news organization. I'm someone who cares about people being informed.
Just very quickly on this, I think this is one of the areas of principal disagreement where I think it's really, really good that Lydia and Strong were to tell very clearly on this. This is sort of a whitelisting approach, right, where you make a positive judgment about these are the sites we will allow on our platforms, the rest can go to hell. I think there's clarity to that. I would add to that another approach is to say the larger the platform, the broader its role in public discourse, the stronger the case might be for a very minimalist, do no harm approach, where you try to prevent truly atrocious crap on the platform, things that are demonstrably harmful, but otherwise try to establish a minimum procedures for how you rank content and then let people have at it. I am perfectly fine with Snapchat making decisions about which publishers are working on Snapchat discovery. I would be absolutely terrified to see Google and Facebook say we will only work with these 200 publishers globally and no one else. That would, from my point of view, would be terrifying.
That's a great point to finish. I want to congratulate Rasmus on his research. I want to thank the panel. I want to wish Campbell happy birthday again.
And thanks so much to the Times for hosting us. And if you're interested in hard copies of the report, they are in the corner. Thanks very much, everyone.